my daughter, my oldest daughter, works in Austria, and she's been there for about a year. But when she was back during Christmas time, she introduced me to one of her friends from graduate school, and she said, "This is my dad, the doctor, but not the kind that makes money or actually helps people." So I appreciate that introduction. I'm going to share with you a little bit of what I've learned in the past 25 years of doing prevention. I've spent my life trying to figure out why kids do the things that their parents tell them not to do, right? Why do they use alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, have unprotected sex, eat Flamin' Hot Cheetos and Mountain Dew, listen to East Coast rap, all the things that we as parents tell our kids not to do. And I'm going to let you know right off the bat, we know some things. Okay, we know some things. And so some of these things that I'm going to talk about today may surprise you. Some of these things you may have heard before. Some of these things may challenge you a little bit. But I ask you to come with an open mind and come away with one thing that you can take back to your organization or your community that you can do to improve the lives of youth in our area. So I think a good place to start out with is talking about what we mean by the term effective. So when we're talking about substance use prevention, we're typically talking about universal prevention programs aimed at all people. And what we've learned this morning is that there are all types of things that folks do in their communities to affect substance use rates and overdoses, incarceration, positive youth development, all of those things. And so when we talk about universal type programs, we talk about prevention programs, things that are done before youth are exposed to risk situation that can place them at greater risk for using alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs. So a good way to think about it is this. We have small children, and at a very young age, we make a decision as parents that we're going to teach them to look both ways before they cross the street. So you probably taught your kids to look left, right, and left again. And we made that decision to teach them that long before we let them play in the front yard or in the cul-de-sac or go over to their friend's house. So we made a conscious decision as a parent to make sure that they had the skills to safely cross the street way before they'd ever need it. And that's what we typically talk about as universal or primary prevention. And then secondary prevention programs are typically aimed at those that are at high risk. So a great example of a secondary prevention program might be harm reduction strategies, right? So these might be things where we have like safe injection zones, or they might be student assistance programs for people, kids in schools that have been caught with drugs or caught with tobacco products. And then we have what we call tertiary prevention programs. And that's really treatment, right? So the best example I can give you of tertiary prevention is incarceration, right? We put people in jail that use drugs or commit drug crimes. Another example of tertiary prevention, which is actually, again, treatment, is where we treat addiction. So what I'm going to talk about today is primary prevention programs, things we do to prepare youth before they ever exposed to risk situations that can place them at greater risk for using alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs. So now that we have an understanding of kind of the three levels of prevention, it's important that we understand what do we mean by effective. What we mean by effective is a strategy that will effectively either delay the onset of alcohol, tobacco, or other drug use, or reduce the frequency, that is how often youth use alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. What we do not mean by effective is the kids like our program. What we don't mean by effective is that we go to work every day and we collect a paycheck because we're very busy. What we don't mean by effective is that kids are more aware of the dangers of drugs. Because I'm in the business, and I'm going to encourage you to think about, you should be in the business of behavior change. Alcohol, tobacco, or the drug use is a behavior. It's not something we feel. It's not something we believe. It's not something we're aware of. It's not something we know. It's something that teenagers do. And in most cases, we know that most approaches, strategies, and programs that are done with youth are not effective. I want to say that again. Most of the programs designed to delay or reduce the frequency of adolescent substance use don't work. Fortunately, as Dr. Hill pointed out today, we do know some things. We do know some things that work. And about 3 years ago, I was at a nationwide conference, and there was about 6 of us up on the panel. And the moderator asked, what is the most pressing public health problem? And so the first person said tobacco use. I'm like, bang, that's my go-to, right? Tobacco use. And then another person said obesity. And then another person said poverty. And another person said health disparities. So I was like the last person on there. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, all the good ones are taken, right? The biggest public health threats are taken. And it just dawned on me what the correct answer was. The most pressing public health problem is not opioid overdose. It's not adolescent marijuana use. It's the fact that there's a chasm as deep and wide as the Grand Canyon between what we know is effective and what's actually done in communities. And I'm partly to blame as a scientist. I don't think we've done a good job as scientists and prevention scientists specifically of communicating what works and what doesn't work for the folks that are doing the work in the community. So when we talk about effectiveness, we talk about getting to the outcome of interest, reducing the likelihood that kids will either start using alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs, or reduce the frequency of their alcohol, tobacco, and other drug. We also need to define what we mean by the evidence. And oftentimes when folks like me talk about evidence, we talk about the scientific evidence. So for example, we talk about the best research evidence that we have, but there's also other sources of evidence that people use. There's contextual evidence, and there's also experiential evidence. Where contextual evidence has to do with the fit of the program in the community, the context in which that program or curricula is going to be used. So for example, if there's only 177 classroom days in a school calendar, and you've got a school-based curriculum to reduce alcohol, tobacco, or other drug use, that's 20 lessons, it's going to be hard for them to fit that into all the other subjects that they have to teach within those 170-something days. So we have to think about the context in which these programs are implemented. Another source of evidence is the experiential evidence, which folks like you bring to bear. It's trying to understand in your community what types of programs are going on, the types of programs that work. And one of the things I've been interested in the last couple of years as it relates to implementation fidelity, which I'll talk about tomorrow, is oftentimes when we talk about experiential evidence, we never ask the population that we're working with. And the population that we should be focusing on are middle school and high school students. So I have a study right now where we're asking kids, well, what's it like when you go to a party? When somebody offers you marijuana, what's happening? What's going on? Why didn't you use? Why did you use? So when we think about this idea of experiential evidence, we have to think about the lived experience of the youth that are faced with these risk situations. So you might be wondering, why is this term effective? Why is this term evidence important? Well, it's important because that's the focus of the National Drug Control Policy. So in about April of 2021, the Biden-Harris mandate for drug control emphasized 2 different things. One thing that it emphasized is harm reduction efforts, a focus on those secondary prevention programs aimed at people that are already at risk for that particular behavior. They're already using marijuana, they're already using opioids, methamphetamine, alcohol, they're already smoking. With another focus on funding evidence-based programs. So how does this affect you in the community? How it's going to affect you in the community, that it's very likely in the near future that if you're using a program that you and your colleagues made up in your community, or a program that you saw, let's say online, or a program that you saw at some convention, it's not likely to be funded because it's not an identified evidence-based program, much like those evidence-based programs that are on the Blueprints database. So it's important that we have an idea of what works and what doesn't work in terms of reducing substance use among youth. Now, there's different types of primary prevention approaches that we can use. We could use universal programs that are aimed at all youth. So in that idea, what we're trying to do is say, okay, listen, all kids at some point in their life are probably going to be involved in a situation where they could be offered alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs. So we want to prepare them from an early age with the skills that they need to refrain from alcohol, tobacco, or other drug use. We could also look at more community-wide programs. These might be policies or structures that change of the availability of drugs or tobacco in their community, or their sanctions for alcohol, tobacco, or their drugs. So for example, one of the projects that I have going on in Southern California is we got a city council at a kind of suburban city of about 65,000 people. We got the city council to adopt a social host ordinance. And what this social host ordinance does is it prohibits allowing teenagers to consume alcohol in the presence of adults, even in your own home. So we created this ordinance and we spent a year educating the community on this ordinance. We had billboards everywhere. We put advertisements in the newspapers. We even added an addendum to the local liquor license law. And when you apply, when like a convenience store or a bar applies for a liquor license, they have to have certain signage up in the window. So it says, did you know that the city of Rupa Valley has a social host ordinance, and explains what that is. Well, as you probably can imagine, these ordinances and laws and policies at the community level are no more effective to the extent to which they're actually enforced. So one of the things that we do twice a year is myself, not all the time, but mostly my research assistants, they go out with sheriff deputies that are specifically assigned to enforce the social host ordinance. So they do not go to any other calls for service on those evenings, those 8 hours down that shift. The only thing we do is we roll around in our unit with the windows down, trying to find the loudest music, and then we walk in to the parties. And if we see adults there allowing youth drinking alcohol, we first try to educate them. If they're compliant, they say they're sorry. We say, okay, good, we've educated them. In the words of one of the deputies that I went with, if they're non-compliant, they're going to get a ticket. And the infraction for the first time for allowing youth to use alcohol in your home is $1,800. And so what we found in the last 2 years, because we've implemented that ordinance, we found reductions in youth alcohol use in that community compared to communities nearby where there's no social host ordinance. So now that we've kind of introduced this idea of effectiveness and different levels of prevention, go ahead and take out your phone, and we're going to do a little poll here. See, I'm one of the cool professors. I let students use their phones in class. So you're going to do a text to Robert, LACHAUS 84. So you're going to text that to the number 37607. So the number you're going to text to is going to be 37607. And then just in the message, just put Robert, LACHAU, I think it's 584. And then I want you to choose, what do you think is the most effective approach? Now, I know it's hard to see, so I'm going to walk you through it real quick. The first one is a school assembly by a motivational speaker on the dangers of drugs. The second one helps kids identify different types of drugs. So what does fentanyl look like? What does marijuana look like? What does methamphetamine look like? The third one, option C, is a scare tactic that says that you could die the first time you use opioids. And then option D is a lesson on increasing self-esteem. And then, of course, you could always choose option E, none of the above. And as people answer, you'll see it populated there. So again, A is a school assembly by a motivational speaker, creating awareness of the problem of drug use. Option B is helping kids understand the different types of drugs and the effect of drugs on their body. Option C is trying to scare kids into not using opioids or even fentanyl because they could die of an overdose. And then option D is a lesson on self-esteem, which is the most effective approach there. Give a couple more seconds for people to respond. And of course, we have the folks playing at home, and it's always easier to play at home, right? I've won millions of dollars in Jeopardy in my living room, but never even got on the show. So what we can see here is about 85% of you chose one of those strategies: a motivational speaker at an assembly at a school, a lesson on the dangers of taking different types of drugs and what different types of drugs are, a scare tactics on opioids, and most of you chose a self-esteem program. So 85% of you said the most effective approach are actually completely ineffective. So we have some stuff to learn if we want to reduce alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use among youth in our community. Now, congratulations for the 15% of you who get a prize at the end of today's session, which is a photograph with me and my autograph. So let's talk a little bit about what the research says about what doesn't work. One of the things we know from about 25 years of health education and drug prevention research is that biomedical approaches with youth are not effective. We have this idea in our head, I think a faulty assumption, that the reason why kids use drugs is they simply don't understand or are not aware of the effect of different drugs on their body. And one of the things I've been doing in the last couple of months is encouraging people to find a teenager that says that smoking is healthy for me and I will give you $20. Most kids understand that taking drugs is not healthy for them. And it's a faulty assumption that the reason why people behave in certain ways as it relates to their health is because they lack awareness or they simply don't have the correct knowledge. In fact, let's just do a show of hand of the folks in the room. How many of you, and again, the law enforcement officers in the room, they're going to give you a little parlay here, but they won't cite you. How many of you in the last 2 weeks have driven over the speed limit? Raise your hand. Well, don't you know you're not supposed to drive over the speed limit? You took a test on it when you were 16. There are little signs along the highway that says how fast you should drive, right? There's little billboards that say speed kills, right? You know you shouldn't drive past, but you do it anyways. Okay, another poll. How many of you guys have ate fast food in the last week? Raise your hand. Well, don't you know you shouldn't eat fast food, right? We're constantly telling people to eat fruits and vegetables and eat healthy. How many of you have been drunk in the last month? No, I don't want to know that, okay? But the idea here is we know even as adults, there are things that we shouldn't do that are bad for us, but we do them anyways. Because the reason why kids use drugs has little to do with their awareness of the dangers of drugs or the effect of drugs on their body. So these biomedical approaches where teachers or guest speakers come in and talk about the effects of drugs on their body or talk about the drug problem in their community do not change the likelihood that kids will either begin using alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs, or reduce the frequency of their substance use. Likewise, informational approaches don't work. So billboards that talk about, well, did you know that 90% of drug and alcohol users started in their teens, or helping kids identify different types of drugs, like this is what fentanyl looks like, or this is what methamphetamine looks like, or this is what different types of marijuana look like. In fact, some of these informational approaches actually can have negative side effects. About 20 years ago, I had an opportunity to evaluate a program where federal agents went into schools and they would show kids on a big board, like a school science project board, and they actually had real drugs taped up on the board. So they had like a dime bag of weed and they had methamphetamine. This was real stuff here. These federal law enforcement officers, they were very protective of it. And we evaluated whether or not that reduced the likelihood of kids using drugs. We compared it to about 1,000 kids who went through that program and then 1,000 kids who didn't go through the program. And one of the things that we found was that kids that went through that program were not less likely a year and a half later to use drugs. It had no effect on their drug use behavior, but it had one interesting effect. The kids went through the program could differentiate between high quality drugs and low quality drugs. So essentially what ended up happening, unbeknownst to these federal law enforcement officers, is they simply made drug consumers and better drug dealers. And I don't think that's the effect that they wanted. Another thing we know that is using guest speakers, whether they're nurses, physicians, law enforcement officers, pastors, actors, celebrities, these approaches don't work. And oftentimes in the prevention science field, we talk about these as edutainers, where they come in and they juggle and they do magic and they say, don't use drugs. And when we look at studies where kids that have gone through these guest speakers or assemblies are no more likely or less likely to use drugs than kids that don't attend these assemblies. We also know that scare tactics are an ineffective approach. In fact, scare tactics have been known to have negative side effects as well. One of the things we know about scare tactics is, particularly among youth, is that when they're exposed to a message that creates arousal or anxiety, it actually has the exact opposite effect. Because that anxiety has been raised, they will actually do the prohibited behavior to restore their freedom. A good example of this is there's a trail that I walk near my house along a mountain in Southern California, and it's a big sign, and it says no shooting in this area. And what do you think that sign is full of? Bullet holes, right? That's reactance theory in practice. So when we scare people, they may have an initial reaction. Their eyes might light up. The kids might go, oh my gosh, wow. But what will happen is they will actually use alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs to reduce anxiety and restore their freedom. And we find that these scare tactic type programs are highly ineffective and actually harmful. There's no better example of this than the famous Scared Straight program. Raise your hand if you've heard of that Scared Straight program. This happened in the 1970s where they brought in youth from New York City into Rikers Island to meet the prisoners. And so they had all the prisoners on the stage, and they brought in these high-risk youth, and the prisoners were like, hey, if I ever see you in this prison because you committed a crime, I'm going to beat you up, or I'm going to sell you for drugs. They really scared these youth. Well, sociologists followed up on these youth about 25 years later, and every one of the youth that went through the Scared Straight program was either dead or in prison. So this is a great example of how scare tactics are not effective in reducing alcohol, tobacco, or other drug use. We also know dramatizations are not effective. And so what's going to happen in my neck of the woods in California, 44 times in the next 2 months, because after all, kids only drink and drive during the months of May and June. There's a program called the Every 15 Minutes program. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Every 15 Minutes program. This is where the cute firemen and the hunky police officers go to the school and they enact a DUI accident at the school. So they bring in a wrecked car, the tow truck, the helicopter comes down, and all the kids are released from AP history to go watch one of their friends who died in a DUI accident. When we've examined the effectiveness of these approaches, what we find is that kids who witnessed Every 15 Minutes program are no less likely to drink and no less likely to drive under the influence as kids that don't witness this program. However, the average cost of the Every 15 Minutes program is about $15,000 per session. The last thing we know from research is that affective only programs don't work. So these are programs that focus on kids, or typically focus on raising kids' self-esteem. And again, we have this erroneous notion that the reason why kids use drugs is because they have low self-esteem. And my research and other people's research, that, by the way, has been done around the world, shows there's no difference between kids that have low self-esteem and high self-esteem and alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use. My research has shown that kids that have very high self-esteem are very likely to participate in risk behaviors, and kids that have low self-esteem are just as likely to participate in alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use behaviors. It is a misnomer that the reason why kids use drugs is because they have low self-esteem. So now that we've taken a look at what doesn't work, let's take a look at what does work. One of the approaches that we know that's highly effective, and not only reducing the likelihood that kids will use drugs, but also reduce the frequency of their drug use, is programs that focus on teaching kids drug resistant skills. So these are skills like identifying a risk situation. What do I mean by identifying a risk situation? This is helping kids, teaching kids, and giving them an opportunity to practice identifying situations that can lead to alcohol, tobacco, or other drug use. So I tell my mom, hey, I'm going over to a party, and I walk into that party, or I walk into over my friend's house. Well, my friend's parents are gone skiing in Bell for the weekend, right? there's a bottle of Boone's Farm on the coffee table and Boyz II Men's playing in the background. That's going to be a risk situation that could lead to alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use. So these programs teach kids, okay, once you've recognized that's a risk situation that can lead to drug use, how do you avoid, manage, or escape that situation? So how would you avoid that situation altogether? Well, maybe I should have went to baseball practice instead of going over to my buddy's house. Well, how do I manage that situation? Well, maybe instead of grabbing a beer, I grab a soda pop. Or how do I escape it if the pressure's too high? Like, what do I do? One of the things that I did with my kids when I gave them a phone when they're in ninth grade, I said, hey, if you're in a situation where you're going to do something that your mom and I told you not to do, just text me. And just text me anything. It could be, a bunch of eyes. And I'll call you back and I'll say, you need to get home and take out the trash. I'll make up something. And then you can just blame it on your dad. Oh, my dad wants me to go home now. Or my dad says I'm in trouble or something like that. I'd much rather look bad in the group of a bunch of high school students than my daughter lose her peer standing. Okay. So we teach these strategies, these practical strategies that kids can actually use. Some other strategies are decision making, right? We also teach, assertive communication. So looking somebody in the eye, stating their name, stating the problem, and coming up with an alternative. We also teach them skills to be able to refute peer pressure. And more importantly, give kids the opportunity in a classroom or an after-school setting to practice those skills. So we'll put them in a role play and we'll say, okay, you're going to be Steve, and you're going to be Julie, and I want you to practice this particular skill. And the facilitator, the teacher, the after-school specialist will go around with a rubric and say, you know what? You initially looked the person in the eye, but then you didn't maintain contact. It's very important when you want to refute peer pressure to keep that eye contact. And we have the kids practice it again and again and again. And in the most effective programs that my youth, where I'm doing my studies, what ends up happening is when they get to about the 10th role play, they're like, oh my God, we've got to use these 4 skills. And I'll say, well, what are the 4 skills? And they'll just rattle them off. And I know if a kid can do that, they're going to be significantly less likely to use drugs. We also know programs that are focused on parents that increase the parents' ability to monitor their child's activities are highly effective in reducing adolescent drug use. So I've done a series of studies in the last 20 years that show when parents have good monitoring relevant knowledge. And what do I mean by that? Parents know where their teen child goes, what they do, and who they're hanging out with. And when parents have that knowledge, they have teens that are less likely to use alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. So what we do in our program is we teach parents how to be effective monitors of their adolescents' behavior. And you're thinking, well, my gosh, I'm a pretty good monitor of my kids' behavior. But what do teenagers sometimes do when you ask them where they're going, who they're hanging out with? What do? They can lie, right? They could withhold information. I'm going over to Susie's house to start a book club, but they're actually going to Steve's house to smoke marijuana, right? So we have to teach parents what are effective strategies in monitoring their children's behavior. And what we've shown in our program is that the parents that go through our program on parental monitoring, they have kids that are about 30% less likely to use drugs, alcohol, and tobacco than the kids of the parents who don't go through our program. We also know that programs that focus more on the entire ecological system in which that adolescent find themselves in are highly effective. So for example, if we focus at the individual level, we can give kids the skills, maybe through a school-based program that they get in middle school and or high school. But we can also increase parents' monitoring abilities in the community. We can offer positive school activities to promote protective factors, where kids will be more likely to hang out with non-drug using peers. We can increase kids' sense of school bonding, or what's oftentimes called school connectedness, because we know that when a kid is really involved in their school and take pride in their school, that they're significantly less likely to use drugs. And then we can also reduce youth access to alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs in the community by having social host ordinances or getting merchants to not sell tobacco, alcohol or marijuana to teens. Recently, we had an opportunity in my research lab to do some decoy operations for our local sheriff's department. And we went to 7 marijuana dispensaries in our community and 33 liquor stores to do attempted buys of either marijuana or tobacco products. In not one case did we have a marijuana dispensary sell marijuana to a minor decoy, but we did have 3 liquor stores, well, 2 liquor stores and a country club sell tobacco products to a 16-year-old. And so it's important that we understand that reducing availability and accessibility in the community is a promising community level strategy that can reduce alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. It's also important, I think, likewise, to understand that many of these approaches will only work if there's the resources to do these different types of approaches. So, for example, if there's not space in the school calendar year to do a school-based intervention, no matter what you do, it's not likely to work. And in fact, oftentimes what schools will tell me is, well, we're so focused on reading and math and history and kind of the core subjects, we don't have time to do substance use prevention education. And one of the things that I always retort with is this, is that a kid that used drugs is not going to be a good learner. So if we're not focused on these high-risk behaviors among middle school and high school kids, they're never going to achieve academically. If we think about the idea that, well, we need to create policy change in our community, and that's difficult to do, whether it be different funding streams to have school resource officers in the schools, or even have more stringent laws or codes to reduce youth access to drugs in the community, those are often difficult to do. And one of the ways that I've been effective in creating policy change in the communities that I work in is you have to identify champions in the community, and they have to be policy leaders. So one of the things that we worked hard on in the last couple of years is when somebody kind of raised their hand and said, hey, I want to be a member of the city council, or I want to be the mayor, we went to talk to them about the issue of substance use among youth right away, in the hopes that if they did get elected, that they would be a champion for our cause. And that's exactly what happened. And as soon as we loaded up the city council, including the mayor, with people that were champions, that were knowledgeable about effective substance use prevention, we saw policy after policy after policy after policy change occur. And now we're seeing reductions in youth alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use. Well, now that we've taken a look at what works and what doesn't work, what I'd like you to do is another poll. I'd like to know what's one thing you've learned so far that you didn't know before. So you can use that same text message and just write one thing that you learned today so far that you didn't know before. And as the responses are populated, you'll see them come up on the screen. Well, there you go. Everybody gets an A for the day. Now you know what works and doesn't work. And we also have a little bit of time if you guys have any questions or comments regarding my presentation. Just raise your hand and Patty will come around. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you have.
Underlying of mental health, but I feel like that's person who doesn't seem like a really good group.
Yeah, so the idea of, well, what are the causes or what are the reasons why teenagers would use alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs is multifaceted. I think if we look at the evidence, the difference between those who become addicted and have substance use problems and those that, let's say, experiment with alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, or even become users later on in life, I think are qualitatively different. So I think in many ways, what we can do is think about the idea that everyone is going to have the opportunity to use alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, and then give them the universal type skills that they need. And for our high risk people, so people that maybe come from a poor developmental background, those types of things, more focused secondary prevention programs for them. Other questions?
Well, and that be the strategy.
Exactly, yep.
Strategy. Isolation. The evidence around just implementing one program, whether it's a curriculum-based program or.
Yeah, I think if you see an example of where maybe there's a school district within a small town or a small city, and they implement a school-based program, let's say in middle school or high school, you might see initial delays in substance use among those kids, but you're not going to see long-term outcomes 2, 3, 4 years out because there hasn't been any structural change. You're also going to be ignoring those kids that are already using alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. So having a comprehensive approach where you're doing something at the primary level, the secondary level, and the tertiary level is crucial to reducing adolescent substance use. So you just cannot just do one thing. You have to do things at the individual level, the family level, the community level in order to be most effective.
Go ahead, Ron.
I guess the question on this, as someone who's looking a lot of curriculum kids, frankly, probably political things, great part of science. You use curriculum that and typically be effective on thinking of some that basically would have cartoons with people listening to reggae music as well as shared that why you want. It's just a lot of things that essentially don't work that would be voted. So I guess I want to be those in the room who are trying to do the best. Make the decisions that will be effective. It's not an easy right now. There's so many different conversations.
Yeah, and I think, like anything else in the United States, there's all types of things that are being promoted, and often we kind of go for the shiny new thing, right? We have a pretty good handle. I don't want to say, with all certainty, but we have a pretty good handle on what works. I think the difficulty is exactly what you're saying is how do you do that? One of the things that Carl had said this morning is, we'll go into a community and we'll say, hey, we've got this evidence-based program that we found on Blueprints. We think it's a good fit. The community members think it's a good fit. And the school district will say, we already have a drug prevention program. And then we'll ask them, well, does it work? Well, of course it works. Well, how do you know? Well, I just know in my heart that it knows that it works, So it's hard. If you've got an ineffective program that's taking up the space and resources, it's very, very difficult to get people used to the fact to not do that approach anymore, because that's the way we've always done it. Several months ago, I gave a talk on a similar topic, and there were a lot of people patting themselves on the back, like, we're doing a really good job, helping teens, and, isn't this wonderful? And I was a little bit more straightforward with them. I said, if we were doing a good job, none of us would be here. We should be trying to work ourselves out of a job. I mean, I hope before I retire, which is only a couple of years, that there'll be significant reductions in adolescent substance use. I don't think that'll be the case, but I think we can always hope.
Can you speak to, so I have a million things going through my head, as well as the questions that I'm trying to synthesize. So can you speak to, considering that many of the people in the room and all of us, even as TTA providers, right, we're constantly being exposed to questions, requests to fund various programs, requests to support various programs. And you have done a lot of work with us in the evaluation realm. For those that would like to implement something different, an intervention that maybe doesn't necessarily come with an established evidence base that they could implement as designed or adapt, right, carefully and thoughtfully. Can you speak to what they might, how they might approach that from an evaluation lens to maybe start developing the evidence base for it very quickly?
Yeah, I think, one of the dilemmas that we face is sometimes people say, well, we want to develop our own program, right? We want to develop our own lessons and things like that. And one of the things that I always tell folks is, I know colleagues that have spent their lifetime working on that. I mean, literally their lifetime. If you look at the community care strategy, that's people's lifetimes worth of work. It is very, very hard and difficult work to do. I think if you are to do that, there's some characteristics that we know of the most effective programs. Teaching refusal skills. The dose has to be adequate. Most programs have to give at least 15 hours of instruction in order for it to work. The facilitators have to be trained in the program and have a background in prevention. You have to focus on peer and social norms, right? Because oftentimes teenagers think, well, everybody smokes marijuana around me, when in fact, that's not the norm. And so try to match their subjective norm to what the actual norm is. Some other kind of characteristics of effective programs are things like increasing perceived risk and susceptibility of the consequences. Those are all key components of any effective approach.
Speaking of role playing, because I know we've mentioned that numerous times now, does role playing still work for older teens, or is that only effective up to a certain age?
I think role playing is an effective pedagogical strategy to give people the opportunity to practice those skills that we want them to learn. So you could use that even with old folks like myself, right? I mean, I'm a pilot, and I had to go through some role plays a couple of weekends ago. What do you do when the engine quits, which is a big deal if you're flying an airplane, by the way. So I think role plays are a good way, because we can't actually put kids or ethically put kids in situations that lead to drugs, right? But if you put them in a role play situation, give them the opportunity to practice those skills, almost like a driving simulator, that's an effective approach.
Okay, thank you. Numerous questions. How to find good materials, implementing drug resistance skills training or parental monitoring training. Carl will be doing a blueprints exercise to walk people through those. Any other ideas?
Blueprints. Let's all get t-shirts that say blueprints on them. I think blueprints, and Dr. Hill will talk about this tomorrow, is a very good way for people to select a strategy and see if it fits in their particular community. There are other registries and databases with evidence-based or promising programs. But I think what the folks have done at the University of Colorado with the blueprints is very, very practical and an excellent tool for selecting a program.
Thank you. And just I would be remiss if I didn't say this. For those of you, we do understand that many of you are engaged in other prevention programs that may not be evaluated right now, right? So we're going to tell you, right, our piece of shining the light is just telling you evaluate it. Just evaluate it. That's the first step. So just talk through, and we're happy to provide TA in that realm to get you started on that. All right, because we've got more time, I'm going to start lightning rounds.
Okay,
All right.
lightning round.
Programs.
I think social norms type programs can work in conjunction with other universal programs. So social norms approach would be changing kids' perception about what's normal to do, right? So kids think it's normal that when you're in high school to smoke or normal to consume alcohol, but what we think everybody's doing is not actually the norm. And what will happen is people, particularly kids, will change their behavior to meet that exaggerated perception. So by telling kids what the real norm is, like, hey, not everybody's smoking marijuana, not everybody's using alcohol, that can actually change their behavior, because again, they'll change their behavior to meet that actual norm. I think in and of themselves is probably not as effective as it could be with some type of skills-based or school-based program.
Okay. In refusal skills role play, what about a bullying here? So could this technique also, or is there evidence to suggest that skills play, the role play, can also address bullying?
Well, I think when I think of bullying, I think like an imbalance of power, right? I think what maybe the person asking the question is, you've got somebody that's really aggressive, right? Very, very aggressive. One of the things that we see in a couple of programs towards no drug use, we see this in Botvind life skills training, is that the role plays, the agitator gets more aggressive as it goes along. So what we do is the first role play is kind of calm, but when they get to like the fourth or fifth one in the second year or third year, there's a lot more pressure put on that person. Hopefully by that time, they have the confidence to overcome that aggressive peer pressure.
Do harm reduction strategies work? We addressed this a little bit earlier, that we know the evidence base is still growing for that, but any response to that question?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think harm reduction approaches, particularly as they relate to opioid and fentanyl overdose, I think we're just starting to see the efficacy or lack of efficacy of these different types of approaches. One thing that I've been doing is studying a Narcan distribution program in our community, where we've trained all of the school staff and faculty, and we've trained all of the law enforcement officers in our county. Well, we're almost all of them. And we've seen about a 19% reduction in opioid overdoses in the last 6 months. That's not to say we can see a causal chain between what we're doing in our trainings and the reduction in opioid overdoses, but I think it's a very promising strategy. One of the things I always share with my students is we shouldn't rely on one study to tell us God's truth. We don't know that something's scientific fact because one study says it. And unfortunately, the knowledge base is probably just too shallow to be able to say that certain harm reduction approaches are better than others.
Thank you. From one viewer, in the past 8 years, I have come back to the prevention arena from treatment, and the same message and approaches still prevail. I am constantly fighting, in quotes, with my school district that what we are doing is not effective. They continue to do the one and done around prom, ribbon week, spring break, etc. How would you advise this particular viewer to maybe start the conversation, build readiness, create dissonance?
Yeah, well, let me start what I would not do. What I would not do is walk into the superintendent's office and say, you're an idiot, you shouldn't be doing this, this is what the research says, things like that. I only know that from personal experience that actually does not work. I think a very, very promising approach, I know this from reading the research, I know it from being a part of this strategy, is the Communities That Care approach. Remember, the Communities That Care is not a school-based program or or a curriculum. It's a strategy for mobilizing people in the community to have a sustained, effective reduction, not only of risk behaviors, but also the promotion of protective factors. So that's where I would start. I would start adoption of that community that cares program, get all the players to strategize, and just understand that going from maybe an ineffective approach to a more effective approach is going to take time and collaboration and advocacy from the ground up.
Robert has been wonderful. He serves as an external consultant for us for ADAPT, and we've worked with numerous communities who have really communicated a similar sentiment, and they are struggling with larger bodies, right? They're wanting to impart a message or questioning really around is what we are investing our resources in truly helping us achieve what we are trying to achieve. And in consultation with Robert, he has really brought them to a place where through a very simple line of questioning, they're able to pause for a moment and ask the exact question that we all started with today. What are we really trying to achieve? And when you really pin someone down on that, and you just pause and they really think about that, and then you move to the next question, which is, I always have Robert in the back of my head. You move to the next question around, okay, is what you're doing, and how do you know that it's working? How do you know that it's actually helping you get to what you just described as your outcome? And there are very rarely very concrete responses to that, right? And so really it is a way of thinking about this. And so I would also suggest to this particular question that, taking a moment to have the conversation like we have been doing through TA, it may not be just one moment. It may be several moments, as it has been the case in our experience with communities, and really meeting them where they're at in terms of the way they're thinking about it right now, but then gently leading them through that line of questioning to a place where they're open to hearing about some of these strategies that we work. What about teaching harm reduction strategies to youth in a classroom setting? This is another TA that we've done with you. Can you talk about, is there a role for them?
So a harm reduction approach in a classroom setting.
Let's just say for middle and or high school youth.
I don't know what that would look like, because when I think of a harm reduction approach, I think of people that are already doing the behavior. So the smokers, the kids that are already using marijuana, the kids that are already using, let's say, prescription drugs. I don't know if a school-based classroom curriculum is really a harm reduction approach. I think of more individual approaches like counseling, group counseling, those types of things.